I'm riding in my B13, and some shit you never seen. Run up if you wanna, blast you with a triple beam. Sipping on the lean when I roll up on the scene. Yeah, I'm riding clean, riding in my B13. I'm riding in my B13, and some shit you never seen. Run up if you wanna, blast you with the triple beam. Nigga, fuck your scat pack, fuck your Hellcat, fuck your 335. Yeah, you riding clean, but I'd rather be riding in my B13.
Yo, we back, man. Last time I gave you guys a parts list of everything that you may possibly need to pull this swap off in your B14. Today, we're going to be putting everything together. Now, I've gone ahead and put all the accessories on the engine, the alternator, AC compressor, power steering pump, all the belts, the passenger side motor mount bracket and mounts, distributor, wire and harness, all of that. Flywheel, clutch, all that's on the engine. I don't know if you guys remember last time I couldn't decide if I wanted to take this transmission and convert it to cable, or if I was going to take the car and convert it to hydraulic, being that this is a hydraulic transmission. What I ended up doing was I took the transmission and converted it to cable because the car is cable already. So just to make everything kind of like a seamless plug and play deal, I decided to convert the transmission to cable. All I need to do is bolt the trans to the engine and then, you know, put in the axles, and this should be ready to go into the car.
All right, so before I get everything together and put it in the car, I'm gonna go over all the electrical connections here, okay? First and foremost, your charging harness. This is the simplest harness in the car, okay? You have your main alternator wire. It's covered by this little red cap. That's held to the alternator with a 12mm bolt, or maybe a 13 if you have an aftermarket alternator. Of course, you know this is your alternator plug. That can't plug anywhere else. That goes to the plug on the alternator. On the side of the alternator, you have a ground, which is held in with an 8mm bolt. And then the harness branches off of that and goes south to the AC compressor. That's one plug with one pin. This is what turns your AC compressor on and off. Now on the other side of your alternator harness, you have a few connections. Now these connections are going to be made on the car side. This is what's going to plug into your passenger side fender well. You have a ground here, two 1-pin plugs and one 3-pin plug. Simplest harness on this engine. This ends up on the passenger side fender well. Now moving right along, we're gonna move on to your engine harness. You have your oxygen sensor here. That's gonna use a 3-pin plug, which plugs in right underneath the distributor or next to the thermostat housing. 3-pin plug. We move up to the distributor. You have a 6-pin plug and a 2-pin plug. Your 6-pin plug is your main plug for your distributor. The 2-pin plug is for your internal coil on your distributor. We're just gonna follow the harness around. You're gonna come across a gray connector. Now this connector, this is what connects the main engine harness to the transmission harness. All right. South of that, we have this is a crank angle sensor. This is what reads the teeth on the flywheel. This goes into the bell housing of the transmission. Moving right along, you're gonna have this leg of wire with 2 plugs on the end. This is your mass airflow sensor plug. It's gonna plug into your MAF. And this one is for an IAT sensor that measures your air intake temperature. So as the harness wraps around, you're gonna have a leg that kind of goes up towards the intake manifold, and then you have another leg which is gonna go down to your ECU plug, which is gonna end up inside the car. So the portion that goes up and towards the intake you have a few connections to make on that end, right? So starting from here, the harness goes up and then it breaks off to go to the TPS over here. Now, this plug is very similar to the mass airflow sensor plug, but the length of it should make it so that you can't get them mixed up between the two, all right? You can follow the harness around. You got two grounds here. They are held on by two 10mm bolts on the intake manifold. Make sure those are clean and tight. If you follow the rest of the harness around, you're gonna end up on the right side of the intake manifold. And then you got some more connections here. This is your idle air control valve. There's two connections for that, a gray plug and a brown plug. Directly underneath your idle air control valve is your auxiliary air valve, which what this does is, this is what raises the RPMs when the engine is cold. Like after you start it, it'll briefly raise the RPMs up. This uses a knock sensor style plug with a little retaining clip in it. You have this big connector right here. And what this does, this is what connects your main engine harness to your injector harness. Now, the injector harness, it has 4 plugs for your injectors and then 1 plug for your knock sensor, which ends up down underneath the intake manifold. All right, so if y'all remembered earlier, I mentioned this plug. This is what connects your main engine harness to your transmission harness. So let's go over that. Let's start with the car side. Now, this is gonna plug into your driver's side frame rail plugs. There's 2 plugs that match these two. You have a 1-pin and then you have an 8-pin. This ring in is gonna go to your battery positive terminal. This is what the starter gets power from. So if we take this harness and follow it around to where it goes, this one runs along the lower back half of the engine, right? So we'll follow that around and it comes to a couple different legs of wires. Now these two, this is gonna be for your neutral switch and reverse. This is what tells your reverse lights to come on. Continue to follow the harness around. We come to another plug. Now this one is for your speed sensor, your vehicle speed sensor. That plugs in here. Continue it around, and then you find this plug. Now this is your starter signal wire. You just plug that into the starter. You have a really big ring in, 90-degree ring in. Now this also goes to your starter. It's gonna be held on with a 12mm bolt, or if you have an aftermarket starter, it might have a 13mm bolt. Continue following this harness. You have another leg of wire that branches off of it. Now this one is gonna go to this evap purge solenoid thing. Follow that back down to the harness, and then you'll notice that when you get here, it branches off again. This is your oil pressure sensor. That's a 1-pin plug, also part of the transmission harness. And if you continue following it, you'll find 2 more plugs on the right side of the intake manifold. These are your coolant temp sensors. One of them is for the ECU to tell the fans when to kick on and off. And then the other one is for your gauge cluster, for your temperature gauge. So now that the transmission is bolted up to the engine, I'm going to go ahead and make all the electrical connections.
starter can go on next. That's held on with 2 bolts. Take your engine harness and put it through the firewall so you don't have to worry about that later. So Will's battery terminals on this car are corroded to hell. We can't have that. You can't do an engine swap and leave the battery terminals like that. So what I've done is I've gone ahead and bought some brand new battery terminals for him. These are gonna look way nicer than what's on there right now. And plus in the future, if he wants to add a sound system or something, this is gonna make it way easier.